The main thing is whatever they're trying to teach you, whether it's in some moral of how to exist in the world, versus science, which is an understanding of the world, not necessarily how to exist in it, outside of, again, the social sciences, but how to understand the world. And I think if we took the concepts of both of them and didn't oppose them as villains, but made them like fraternal siblings, then we could go further.
Hey, thanks for listening to the podcast. I'm your host, Scott Miller. Let's create a cooler world. Welcome, everyone. Derek Haynes is our guest today. Derek is a botanist, creative and scientific communicator, and educator with a passion for sharing knowledge and driving results. Inspired by notable Black plant researchers and scientists like George Washington Carver and Percy Julian, Derek earned a degree in plant biology from North Carolina State University and spent over 9 years working for Medicago, a biotechnology company that worked to develop vaccines and therapeutics using non-traditional plant-based technologies. Merging together education, his signature wit and humor, and his keen love for plants and science, Derek's mission is to pull the traditional knowledge of our ancestors into the mainstream. He's known affectionately as the Chocolate Botanist on Instagram and has built a community of over 15,000 like-minded people who have come to respect both his incredible depth of knowledge and the palpable joy he cultivates with the subject matter. Derek has led numerous in-person lectures and workshops here in the Research Triangle area of North Carolina and currently serves on the board of directors of the North Carolina Botanical Garden Foundation. Derek, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me, Scott.
I'm excited to be talking to you again on this podcast. There were some things that we touched on the last time you were a guest on my other podcast that might be interesting to expand on in terms of your experience as a science educator, the things that inspired you, people who inspired you, and some of the ways that you're looking to inspire and motivate other people. Maybe I'm going to let you talk a little bit about that first. Talk a little bit about your inspiration and what got you interested in becoming a scientist.
An open-ended question. I love it. So as a child of the 90s, back when there were only 151 Pokemon, a PlayStation 1, and I thought for sure the Sega was going to really overtake the console war. There was a couple of shows that I used to love growing up. So firstly, I have to say, my family supported my scientific adventures for the most part, because I would have these grandiose dreams of being an inventor and fixing the world and fighting pollution with different machinery and things I would draw up and draft up. And God knows, I wish I still had those old notepads that showed the random inventions I would show, and I would write how they would fix this. And there was one even, and this is going to be sidetracked, there was one even I had, it was like, it was going to fix the earth and go through and get rid of all the trash off of the earth and go through the water and clear out the trash there and clear out the smog in the air. Such big plans. Derek hates engineering, so he didn't do that. But I loved the Magic School Bus. The Magic School Bus was my Jimmy Jam. And the other shows I liked were Bill Nye, of course. Everybody loved Bill Nye. But a lot of people don't know about Beekman's Lab.
Beekman's Lab.
Beekman was like we have Bill Nye at home. Like we're not going to go and stop by McDonald's. We got McDonald's at home. It was the same thing for Bill Nye. It was a very similar concept, but it was also like a giant rat. And Beekman had his own assistant. I haven't seen it in years, but I used to love that show. So those shows excited me. In addition to whenever I would want something scientific, my grandmother would just get it. So like different books or anything else like that, she fed into that passion. So though that is a part of my love of science. And then the science educator part, I had great teachers all around, from elementary school to middle school to high school. Like the way these teachers would give out information were phenomenal. So James W. Smith Elementary School in Cove City, Grover C. Fields in New Bern, and New Bern High School in New Bern were phenomenal. And then getting to Craven Community College again in New Bern, I ran into just a slew of teachers who had a passion for what they did. And looking back, you can tell they loved it. And I hope to bring that same passion with everything I do.
Thank you for sharing that. Okay, so as a side note, if you are a frequent listener of our other podcast, Task Time Energy, the purpose-filled productivity podcast, you may know that my wife and I have two wonderful and very energetic dogs, and they're not very good at staying quiet, especially when people come over to visit. We've been working to manage that situation, especially when we're trying to record a podcast episode here at my house. But if you hear a little bit of jingling or other dog noises in the background, that's what you're hearing. And I'm very grateful for your patience and your understanding. I did a little bit of homework in preparation for this episode. Yeah.
That's homework.
Yeah. So I was looking, because I remember you saying, and I may have gotten this in your bio, that you were inspired by notable Black plant researchers and scientists like George Washington Carver and Percy Julian.
Ooh.
I did some homework and was reading about George Washington Carver again. There's such a, I think, great parallel to what a lot of people are trying to do today, which is, so he developed techniques to improve soil that was depleted by repeated plantings of cotton. Mm-hmm. So we're talking about crop rotation, right? Rather than planting the same crop over and over again, he was encouraging farmers to plant other crops like peanuts and sweet potatoes. So as an alternative cash crop and to rejuvenate the soil, but also he was interested in giving poor farmers a way to feed themselves, right, through these crops. Not just commercially improve commercial production of cotton by replenishing the soil, but help people improve their lives. And I think there's an interesting parallel to that, to what a lot of people are trying to do today, which is try to find ways to maybe heal or at least stop doing some of the damage that we're doing to the planet, right?
Yes.
While at the same time improving potentially people's quality of life.
That is beautiful that you mentioned that. When I look, and I did some research about him a couple of years ago for a podcast I was going to be on, I learned that he would also talk about tenets of organic gardening. So like going into the forest and getting that leaf litter and that detritus on the ground and saying like, let's mix this back into our fields and into our gardens. So he was so cool, ahead of the game. Like it's actually nuts, pun intended, to think about, because he was a Black scientist in a time and in an era whereas Blackness wasn't respected, and especially your position as a person in STEM and science was not respected. And to see what he did and how he would show off what you could do with a little gumption or a little bit or some combination thereof is ever inspiring. So I'm glad you got to tell the people that he's more than just a peanut guy.
Another thing you talked about earlier in the last podcast was being an inspiration for other people. And you talked about how, there was a lack of Black science teachers when you were growing up.
Oh, yes.
And I think the quote you said was you wanted to be there for Black children so they can see you saying, hey, look, I'm a scientist. I'm doing this.
Yes, that sounds like me. That sounds like me. You got that right.
And this seems like a really important topic when it comes to science education, because like I was just reading a post yesterday by Catherine Hayhoe, who is a professor at Texas Tech, chief scientist at the Nature Conservancy. And she was talking about how low-income neighborhoods and often non-white people are bearing the brunt of the effects of climate change.
Yes.
She was specifically talking about like how in the same, well, I'm going to just kind of read this. Even in the same city, low-income neighborhoods can be up to 15 degrees Fahrenheit hotter than high-income neighborhoods in the same city during a heat wave, primarily due to the lack of green spaces and tree cover, exacerbated by the fact that poorer areas are often next to sources of heat, like industrial areas. This means that poorer and often a greater proportion of non-white people are at much greater risk from heat-related stress, illness, and even death. It's yet another example of how climate change is a threat multiplier, exacerbating the risks facing the most vulnerable and already marginalized people today. It seems like often when there is a lack of representation in a certain area, like a certain career, there's also a lack of people from that community being served in that career.
I think that's a good assertion. And here's why. So to get into the first point of me wanting to show people that I'm a Black scientist, I said earlier, and I'm not contradicting myself, just precautionary. I said earlier, my family was mostly supportive in all of my scientific exploits. But when I said, hey, I want to be a botanist, one question I would get from all of them would be, what's a Black botanist that you know that's living? Now, they would name, I should be a teacher or a lawyer or a doctor or a politician, because these things are supposed to be so much better than these things. But I don't know what Black politician or lawyer we knew. I have a cousin who's a judge up north, so maybe they were thinking of her, but there was no Black references they could think of. And while it was frustrating to me in my younger years, being like, why aren't you supporting me? I can look back now as an older man and be like, hey, y'all are just thinking how difficult it can be to be the first or the only in the field. Mm-hmm. So one exercise I'm going to start having people do in some of my other sessions I've been thinking of, like classes I've been thinking of about diversity in the plantscape, is saying to a person, think about a time that you've walked into a room and said, I am the only blank, whatever form of diversity that is, whether it's I'm the youngest, I'm the eldest, but moreover, I am the only Black person. I am the only woman. I am the only queer person, whatever that may be, because that really makes you feel different. But to jump tracks, it does make sense that if there are a lack of diverse people represented in an area, then that would continue the systemic issues of racism. So if you grow up in a neighborhood where you did have those greenscapes, you were of a socioeconomic status where you were able to get them and you didn't necessarily pay attention to the lower income housing in areas, you're not going to really pay attention and want to give money to those other neighborhoods unless you really have the empathy and you meet people and you hear their stories. Mm-hmm. So without that firsthand experience, it then takes somebody else to tell you, or for somebody else to see it, or for you to see it yourself in some way, shape, or form. But the time that takes, like she's saying, there's people who are dying from heat stroke. There's people who are struggling to pay their electric bills, their AC bills, people who are in a hot house cooking food and who are already eating food that may not be the best for them, because most of those lower income areas are also food deserts. So now it takes forever for you to get good food. It could just be a horrible issue. And on a related note of that, even not necessarily climate change, but having diversity represented to be able to positively impact all people. I used to tutor a student who lived in a lower income area of Durham. Whenever I would go to his house, like I would go to any of my students' house, I would go to a convenience store near them. I went to the convenience store. I usually look for like water, grapefruit juice. I love grapefruit juice and orange juice. You get me those things, the right grapefruit juice and orange juice, because not all of them are good. I am your friend. But I went looking for them and I was a little hungry. So I wanted one of them nature fig bars. Couldn't find any of that. The water I could find, but the juices were not the fruit juices or the partial fruit juices. It was all the fake stuff. The fruits and vegetables, or the fruits I'm used to seeing in a store, sometimes you'll see a random banana and orange. Nothing. It was all junk. I love junk, but I'm not looking for that. But there was no positive options for me to choose, meaning that all the kids and all the older people, this is what's close to them. This is in walking distance or quick driving distance, biking distance. They are only getting stuff that's going to keep them unhealthy and unnutrified, if I can use that as a term, and I did, for the world. So it's horrible, but hopefully more eyes will be open soon and the world will change.
If you don't have exposure to a problem, it's just not going to be on your radar, right? So if you don't grow up, you can drive through a neighborhood, but that's different from living there, being there, and seeing the problems. So either you're just not going to be aware of it, or maybe somebody helps you become aware of it in a way that it becomes important to you.
Yes.
But it's so easy for that to not happen.
And it is easy for that not to happen. But even when it does happen, the time that it can take is still not as quick or urgent as when you have that firsthand experience. Like when you mention the greenscapes, non-existent greenscapes of lower socioeconomic areas, I can reference that. I lived in, I would summer in a lower economic area back home in Newbern, Craven Terrace. And that had like a couple of fields where you could play in. But outside of that, there weren't like all the trees and the lushness that you would see in an area like Greenbrier, which was very well-to-do, or Taberna. These are all New Bernian areas. So those of you in New Bern, y'all, I'm speaking your language. But for us here, it's like going to the part of Durham near Lawson Street and saying like, okay, like you all have some grass here. That's true. But there's not like a lot of tree coverage over your house. And then comparing that to North Durham, which is country, trees or whatever, or even areas near Chapel Hill, where again, there's a lot of beautiful trees, a lot of beautiful houses. You drive into Chapel Hill, it's gorgeous, right? Having that experience is everything, because experience can create urgency. And without that, I have to give you my experience and hope you get urgent. But the people who are living in those situations don't have time for hope. They need you. They need me. They need us to be urgent.
Yeah. Yeah. Just that one fact, I was yesterday years old when I learned, like I was aware that the tree cover makes a difference, but I was yesterday years old when I learned that 15 degrees Fahrenheit difference during a heat wave is the difference between living on a nice tree-lined street and one that's just concrete, which is huge. It's like, imagine saying, oh, it's 90 degrees today. Well, that's hot, but 105
it's hotter.
Is a whole different story. Yeah.
It's different. 70 and 85, a cool breeze versus, oh, I'm sweating a little bit. That's a difference.
Yeah. I'm wondering if we can switch subjects a little bit. You mentioned Bill Nye earlier.
Yes.
And again, doing my homework, I was watching some Bill Nye videos last night. And one thing he said is, he was responding to some questions that people had, submitted. And one person was asking basically like, how do we know that we should believe the scientists, or how should we trust the scientists? And he talked a little bit about how science works and answers that question. But the one thing he said at the end was, what we want is for you to be able to evaluate the claims of scientists. This is why we want science education for everyone. And so maybe shifting that to the importance of science education, like I'm even thinking for myself. So I'm going to give a little background. I have a question and maybe then would love to hear your answer to it.
I love it.
But in the process of creating this podcast, I want to become more educated about climate change, about the climate crisis, about the causes and effects and the research that's being done. I mean, I know a little bit that I've read here and there, but as someone who is not a scientist, I don't have a degree in science. In botany or any, STEM subject. My, I guess, challenge for myself right now is to find reliable information. So, for example, like I was going recently on the NOAA website, right? The National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Association, they are the department of the government that runs the National Hurricane Center, where we get all of our information about hurricanes, and the National Weather Service, where when you get your weather report every morning, that's where it's coming from. I'm going on the NASA website, right? So I think we can look to certain places and say, okay, this is likely to be reliable information. But at the same time, if you're looking at maybe some post on social media and you have people talking about how the vast majority of scientists on the planet agree that we are seeing massive changes in global temperature, unprecedented, that this is caused by human activity. And then you have the person chiming in and saying, well, Professor so-and-so at UCLA, who is a accomplished researcher, disagrees and says this and that. So, I mean, what can you share? Thoughts do you have for just the layperson about finding reliable sources of information when we want to educate ourselves about things like this?
So it's funny you asked this, because this has been a burning thought in the back of my mind, because In the Black community, we often have a distrust of science and scientists and these professionals because in our past, in our not so distant past, that has been used to belittle us, to justify us being treated a certain type of way or anything, whether it's the Tuskegee experiments, whether it's slavery and people saying that Black people are less than and they're stupid and they're this and they're aggressive and they're prone to rape and this and that and the other, or whether it's something which we've recently seen somewhat resolved, hopefully, the Henrietta Lacks situation, whereas cells were stolen from a Black woman. Hashtag Black women fix everything. I like to always say that when I can, because they do. And her cells, her physiology was as such where it led to, I'm sure, billions of dollars of innovation that had that money been set aside, a portion of that innovation, they had to pay into a fund and set it aside. That could have been reparations for Black folk.
As a side note, if you don't know who Henrietta Lacks is, her story is an important and in some ways unsettling story about science, medicine, and ethics. If you're interested in any of those topics, I recommend learning more about her. Henrietta Lacks was a Black woman who was being treated for cancer back in 1951. A biopsy was performed and a sample of her cells was collected for laboratory testing. Those cells were found to have properties that made them very unique and very valuable for medical research. Henrietta Lacks died from her illness later that year. Researchers took additional samples of her cells after her death and continued to study them. Those cells have led to many important scientific breakthroughs, including the development of the polio vaccine and others, including COVID-19 vaccines. This line of cells has been used to research cancer, AIDS, and gene mapping, and aided in the development of in vitro fertilization. But all of this was done without the knowledge or consent of Henrietta Lacks or her family. Companies profited immensely from these discoveries, while the family of Henrietta Lacks received no compensation. Her family didn't even know that this research was being done until they learned about it in the 1970s. I'll include some links in the show notes to articles about Henrietta Lacks. If you don't know about her, I encourage you to read some of these articles.
When it comes to understanding and exploring science, there's a couple of things we have to understand. So anecdotal evidence isn't really evidence. It's just a great story. So an example can be there are people who will say certain foods, certain vegetables are the best in the world. And because Dr. Sebi said this is one of these herbalist fake people. And, my grandmama said that, this and that, one or the other. And my uncle had cancer and he doesn't have it no more. And it's anecdotal evidence. We don't have the full story. We just have an impassioned story versus repeatable peer-reviewed evidence, which is what science truly is. Science is us as a group, not necessarily one person, but us as a group confirming this is the way of our existence. Whether it's biology in any of its facets, whether it's geology, whether it's astronomy, whether it's any of those legitimate things. Okay. Even the field of psychology, right? And sociology. These are the science behind of how people act or how animals evolve or how the world turns on its axis. That is what it is. And it isn't, again, one person saying X, Y, Z without being able to be proven, but it's more so a group of people who have said, whoever found this, can we all prove it? And if we can all find the same thing, then it's science. It's legitimate. When it comes to doing the research, you mentioned great websites that I'm sure have a .gov on the end of them. So that means that they are verified. They are legitimate. They are not sources that somebody or any of us can just put random things on. So when people are researching, I'll generally tell them, I may start for myself with Wikipedia. Yes, we hear about Wikipedia being the worst thing in the world, but they generally have references at the bottom. Those references I can follow to more legitimate sources, or I'll go to one of my YouTube shows I'll watch and be like, hey, tell me about this, or ChatGPT with the AI, tell me about this and give me references. And then I'll check the references and make sure I'm getting something legitimate. So a .gov or a .edu, or if it's a .com from a legitimate web source that again isn't about just trying to spread misinformation. That is what it's about. But most people, Scott, you named a lot of great sources to use, but most people are getting their information from social media. And there are a lot of big pages on social media who are coming off as experts in something they have not studied in. And typically what I will tell a person who is like, I don't, how can I trust these scientists? How can I trust these people? We all have some guardian or care person, for the most part, who knows us inside and out. We have good friends who know us inside and out. If I take a picture with people and I'm not comfortable, you may not notice it, but I have good friends who'll be like, yeah, you were uncomfortable and it's all over you in this picture. And they know. I can mask my personality perfectly, but there's some people who can still see enough to be like, yeah, Derek don't like this person, even though he's faking. Mm-hmm. So there are some people who are experts in us. My mom knows me. My family know me. I have close friends. They know me. I'm never going to say they don't know me. They've studied me and they've been around me and put that time in. Scientists have done the same thing. They've studied biology. Me with plant biology, for example, that was 2008, starting to get my associates, to 2017, finishing and getting my bachelor's, in addition to working in the field and doing everything else and other little things I'd find on my own and be like, oh, this is so cool. I've dedicated that life and that effort. These scientists have done that. And for those who will reference another scientist who will be like, well, no, I don't believe that. If that scientist has proof, like, okay, you say climate change isn't happening. If you have legitimate proof, phenomenal. But it has to be more than just it snowed in Montana last week, so climate change isn't real. It has to be your own science, your own study showing that the climate isn't changing as we think it is. But it's obvious to any of us with somebody's sense that it's changing, because any of us can reference like the incidents of snow or storms or heat waves from our childhood, even though we may not have a again, scientific research data driven thing. We can reference, things are different than they used to be. Science doesn't care how you feel. Science doesn't care what you believe. It just is. Mm-hmm. I can say all day that the sky is striped black and yellow. And that is my belief. But the fact of the matter is it's blue. So I hope that long answer helps that short question you gave me.
Yeah, there's a lot in there. There were a few good things in there. And I forgot which one I wanted to ask you about.
I know. I was like, I really have to break this down, because to be a scientific communicator, to be a scientific educator means that I have to often come against what people have believed in addition to myself, I have been taught wrong stuff that I then spread to other people. And I have to stop that, just as the rest of us do. I'm not saying that you non-scientists should, just hush up in conversations. There's some conversations where it's like, okay, you can't speak as an authority, but you can ask questions. But it's a very tangled mess to try to undo. And as you undo more, somehow there's more yarn and more strings. And it's like, will we ever get this done? Maybe one day. But right now it's just a lot of inputs.
Mm-hmm. Well, one thing you're talking about is belief. Mm-hmm. And that seems to be a thing that we need to be careful about. It can be really appealing when we see something that seems to be coming from a reliable source.
Yes.
That happens to match our own existing beliefs.
Oh, yes.
And we do tend to gravitate towards that.
That's right. Confirmational bias.
Yeah, confirmational bias. There are certain things about climate change that I have seen enough and seen from what I feel are reliable sources. Mm-hmm. So I have my existing understanding of it. We'll say not even belief, but my existing understanding of the subject. But it seems like it would be really easy for me now to gravitate towards those articles or whatever that I see that just simply matches that current understanding or aligns with that current understanding. And that's why I'm willing to be a little skeptical, and not, skeptical of thousands and thousands of scientists who are in agreement about something, but skeptical of my understanding of it, to where I say, hey, have I interpreted this in a wrong way? Have I maybe not read some of the latest information about this. So I'm willing to look at different sources and go, okay, how would I evaluate that objectively? There's always going to be certain disagreement. I think that's what makes it science.
Yes.
It's natural to have a certain person say, well, I have a different opinion about that, or I have, maybe opinion is the wrong word, but I'm interpreting the evidence in a different way.
Like a different understanding.
A different understanding. Yeah. So that's going to be natural. But how do we look at that? And rather than being sucked into it and say, oh yeah, well, because Professor X says this, these other thousands of people must be wrong.
I think the true thing is you're speaking about coming from a place of humility, right? And there's a lot of people who don't do that because they are sure that whatever they believe is correct. So if they believe that, for example, the earth is flat, that's just one thing that a lot of people will believe. And they have people behind them who will support the notion that the earth is flat and that the ice wall and NASA, all the stuff. If you don't know about flat earth theory, really learn about it, because that's one way you can understand how to come to a conversation with people who don't have the same understanding of science as you. Mm-hmm. When it comes to that, I can speak to different things, but I can only speak to my understanding because I'm a plant biologist, right? My understanding isn't of the geology of the world, the astronomy of the universe, all of this other stuff, right? I can only speak at a certain level. So I think one part is acknowledging what your limitations are, right? So if somebody is saying that seedless plants are GMO, anything seedless is genetically modified, and there's all these genetically modified things in the world, that I have to speak from a thing of, okay, you're speaking from belief because you have no evidence to prove it. When they say they do, I'm like, this is a quote from somebody. There's no documentation that says X, Y, Z. You're peeking off of a quote or an infographic you saw on Facebook. You can't give me any credible resources. Mm-hmm. And as the expert, that's where I can be like, yeah, no, this is not it. You can feel whatever you want to feel. Your feeling is wrong. And it's something where we have to come at it in that way. But again, those people that I have to do that with may not necessarily be speaking from the humility that you're speaking from, because you're able to say, like, I don't got it all. I don't have it all. I don't know it all. I'm just trying to learn. And there's some people who say, I have it. The answers are here. And I got it over these thousands of scientists who have spent time and effort and money to learn this thing for 10, 20, 30 years. In an hour, I got the information. So I think it's beautiful, again, to have those conversations and to be open to those conversations of trying to see why a person believes, whether right or wrong, why they believe or have that understanding of that science they do. And that way, again, in my opinion, it can deepen your own understanding of the true science of the world. Like, thinking about flat earthers, I can be like, well, I do actually, with my understanding of science, I can actually say, well, no, this doesn't make sense because of X, Y, Z, because of how light moves or based on how gravity works in the atmosphere and everything else. This little bit of knowledge I have. But with other stuff where I'm like, yeah, that's not me. Mm-hmm. Hey, I don't have the answer. Go and talk to this person, or go and look this up, or, hey, I just don't got it.
Yeah, and that humility seems to be an important piece of it. Just thinking of a recent guest I had on my other podcast, the Task Time Energy podcast, Dr. Isabel Roth, who is a researcher at the UNC School of Medicine. And part of her research, some of her research, involves mindfulness. So we're talking about mindfulness, but even within that topic, she was very clear to say, well, this is not my area of expertise. Mm-hmm. I will give you my thoughts about this, but this is not my area of expertise. So very willing to draw that line and very willing, very confident in what she knows. And maybe to some degree, because of that confidence in what she knows, she is very willing and very openly willing to say, well, this is not something that I'm an expert in. As opposed to, I'm just thinking of someone else I listened to recently who was not highly qualified in the area that they were discussing.
You're putting that so nice.
But yet very, very, very
confident
in what they were saying, or sounding very confident, making these statements as if they were fact.
And those people, Scott, they really are. They're not even trying. Some may be trying, but they really are confident in being wrong. Yeah. That's just really the way to put it. But again, humility says, I don't know everything. I haven't figured out this. But arrogance, an ego will say, I have it and these other people don't.
What I see when I start looking at scientific research or listen to scientists talking about their research, basically what they're saying is this is the evidence we have collected. And based on our evaluation of the evidence, these are the predictions that we can make. And that's really what people say science is all about.
It is.
And not saying that this is set in stone fact, but rather this is what the evidence indicates.
That is a big thing, right? So recapping and kind of showing people, like, when you're trying to figure out who's real and who's fraudulent. If somebody says they have all the answers and they talk with that assurance and you cannot question anything they say, then that person is not legitimate. And that's in any area of life you go to. At my church, I can question respectfully. I'm not like, shaking him up, but I can question my pastor. I can ask him questions. I can have deep, thought-provoking conversations about faith and religiosity with him, right? I can do the same with professors at state or any other academic institution. But when you run into the person, like I typically do, who doesn't know what they're talking about legitimately, and I ask them the questions that they don't have the answers to, now they're frustrated. And that frustration and anger, people will say, well, no, Derek is just trying to pick and da-da-da-da-da. And it's like, no, this person really doesn't know what they're talking about. And I'm exposing them, but they're responding in anger because instead of, responding in, hey, I don't know what I'm talking about. But part two of that is, oh, Jesus, let's see, you had said, saying what she didn't know. I see, I should have been taking notes. You said say what she didn't know.
Well, this is a person who is maybe presenting themselves as more qualified than they really were, and was saying things that were not true. I'm just gonna lay it out there. This person was saying certain things that were not true, but stating them with great certainty and great authority as if these are the facts. Without dispute.
So those people, again, it's hard because if you don't know enough about an area, and I think that goes back into humility and self-reflection. If you don't know enough about an area, you cannot then say this person is an authority because they're speaking to what you don't know. There's a couple of people who people will think are authorities on plant nutrition and herbalism, and they're using terms like alkalinity incorrectly, and they're using terms like GMOs and hybrid and breeding incorrectly. And they, again, put up these anecdotal stories that wrap you into an emotional state. Because emotion is easy. All of us know emotion. But when it comes to the science of it all, they have nothing. They have a bunch of gobbledygook put together. And that's where, again, it takes knowing people. On my platforms, I'll let people know, you tag me in something, I'll let you know if it's legitimate or not. And I'll tell you why. And most of my content lately has been, this is crazy. This is stupid. And let me tell you why. Because of X, Y, Z. But on the scientific field, and I know it's easy to point at the frauds, but on the scientist spin, I often have to be like, we as scientists can do better in communicating. We as the communicators of our fields can do better at making the information accessible and easier for the layperson. So they won't get tied up and wrapped up. So because I can tell people stuff in a very easy way, a very to their level way, that has been like my true benefit on my platforms. But there's some people who can't take their $50 idea and make it into $2 chunks or $5 chunks. They don't have that ability. But these scammers, these grifters, these fraudulent folks, and again, let's just put it out there. They're lying to get something from you, whether it's power over you or your attention or your money or some combination therein. They speak to that person's level. So now they're feeling like they're empowered. They're feeling like they got the right information. And now they're going to be a sentinel of this, an apostle of it, spreading that information out to the world.
There seems to be a question that we can all ask ourselves, which is, what is this person trying to get from me by sharing this information, and maybe an awareness of that? Like, what are they trying to gain? And then also, again, getting back to the humility and looking at scientists as a great example of this, being willing to say, hey, listen, I spent all afternoon reading about this or watching videos on TikTok or whatever, but that doesn't mean that I really understand it. maybe I have the beginning of an understanding, or I've just started exploring it. But being willing to say, I don't know, or I don't know yet, or I'm just a beginner, or I'm just starting to learn, rather than needing that certainty, which I think is what a lot of people are looking for, and why some of these scammers are so successful, is because people want that certainty and that feeling of control that it gives them. But you mentioned, taking a $50 idea and breaking it down into $2 chunks. I mean, it sounds like that's one way to successfully communicate, break things down into simpler or smaller pieces. What are some other things that you think, opportunities that you see, ways that scientists could be communicating their ideas more effectively so that more people could understand them?
Really, it starts with reaching people where they are and breaking down that idea. Like, that's really the main goal. Because if you can make the big concept of evolution or genetic modification or breeding or plant biology as a whole, for an example, because it's my area, I love plants. If you can make that digestible, and now that person has legitimate information that they not only can retain, but they can then spread. That is the start of everything. Because once I give you the right information and I tell you, something is, and I give you resources and I give you, additional information, and and I don't make it seem like homework. I don't make it seem boring. I don't make it seem dry and tasteless, but I give you something that is empowering and exciting you. You're going to have that love and passion forever. And I think in general, it's that, and again, fighting the mindset that science is dry and dull and boring. Like, I'm not going to just tell someone that hybridizing takes, this and that and the other, and two halotypes and using all these big words. I'm going to, if I do use a term, I'll explain it. Mm-hmm. And then once I explain it and I make sure like you got it, I'll give you a reference. That reference may be a cartoon show that you watch for the younger people, or people like me that are familiar with certain cartoons or anime, a certain TV show I might reference. I'll try to reach where that person understands whatever they have an understanding of, whatever they have an attachment of, and then make that correlation so they can see it. Mm-hmm. So when I talk about hybridizing plants, I'll reference Steven Universe, right? A good cartoon that used to come on in the 2010s, I think. Great. They would talk about fusion, and different fusions had different things and stuff like that, which would represent hybrid vigor, right? Or Dragon Ball Z. A lot of anime fans would watch that, see the fusion dance. Again, you have pros and cons of these fusions coming together, and that's similar to hybridizing of plants. You have that, again, that hybrid vigor. It's stronger than its two parents. Seedless plants, when people are talking about seedless plants, and I don't understand how plants are seedless, everything's supposed to have a seed. I talk about people that we all know and are around who can't have kids. Mm-hmm. People who cannot have children. They are seedless, right? But we don't look at them as if they are genetic anomalies, as if they are freaks. It just happens. That's why we have sperm banks and fertility clinics and, all of these other things, right? We're familiar with those processes. They're a normal part of our lives. But when the plants can't produce, we look at it as if it's a government plot. And the last thing with that is, when any of those people talk about these government plots and these conspiracy theories, I often say, you're crazy, not just because you're believing in these conspiracy theories, but you're crazy because if the government wanted to control your food, they could do so. If there was some big game to get over on us, it's easy. You don't have to do it in the food. Everybody drinks water in some way, shape, or form. Even if you drink nothing but Mountain Dews every day, that Mountain Dew has a base, which is water. You can put anything in the water. The conspiracy theories are never sensical because they always make it convoluted and complicated.
What I was thinking of, just to kind of like put a point on this conversation about how do we find reliable information, is so we pay attention to how willing somebody is to field a question. Mm-hmm. What happens when we ask them a question? Are they willing to listen? Do they have a good answer to that question, or do they get defensive about it? Mm-hmm. Do they get offended? Are we willing to stay humble ourselves and say, hey, I may have spent some time reading about this subject, but that doesn't mean I know everything. That doesn't make me an expert. How much do I feel like I need to know, in order to feel like I'm in control of something? Versus, am I just curious about this? Do I really want to learn? Because I think that's probably an important part of genuinely learning is it comes from a place of curiosity, of wanting to know, not necessarily needing to be certain, maybe.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
The other thing I wanted to ask you about, and this will be our last topic, but something I think about a lot, and maybe you've thought about this too. A lot of people perceive this rift between, like, let's say, spirituality and faith and science. And there seems to be this perception that, and I think it comes from a little bit from both sides, that I guess what I'm getting at is it seems like there are two ways that we can know things. There's our intellectual, analytical way of knowing things, and then there are our feelings. And it seems like both have a certain amount of validity or use to us in certain situations. Like there are certain situations where our feelings, like listening to our feelings, paying attention to our feelings, are useful.
Yes.
Now, if we're trying to understand a concept like why are there plants without seeds, our feelings aren't really useful in that situation as much as our ability to analyze and understand things. But how much opportunity do you think there is, or interest there is, in, rather than seeing these two things as two separate and conflicting ways of understanding the world, that there's an opportunity to just recognize that in some cases we want to pay attention to our intellect and our ability to analyze things. And in other cases, it's okay to say, this is the way I feel about this. This is what I believe. This is what I feel. And that's valuable to me and that's useful to me. Versus, we're going to talk about this and we're going to come to a more intellectual understanding of this. I don't know if any of that makes sense.
It does. And Derek is trying to find the name of the professor that he had that in Craven Community College. I had a professor for a biology class and I cannot think of his name. Matthew Palmtag. Professor Matthew Palmtag. I just emailed him. We have not talked since 2009. And I believe it was either him or Chip Duncan, but I feel like it was Matthew Palmtag. We'll see. It's probably Chip Duncan. Either way, great biology teachers. One of them or both of them said it, but he described it as this. He said there are three boats that exist when it comes to talking about spirituality and science. There's one group of people in one boat that is all spirituality. That science stuff is not really important to me. It doesn't exist. It's not real. Whatever you want to say, they are spirituality over everything. So they may not believe in evolution or whatever it may be, and that's their worldview. There's another group of people who say science is king, that faith and belief don't really have a place in the world because they are ephemeral. They're temporary. They're not something you can get a grasp on. And then there's a boat of people who somehow blend in whatever way they do, science and faith. For me, I am in that last boat because I feel like both of them have a place in this here world in their own different situations, right? So as a scientist in my roles there, I may be more understanding or compassionate to a person based on my religiosity. I may bite my tongue a little bit more based on my religiosity, but I'm not going to say, hey guys, Jesus just showed me the answer. Even if it was happening that way where I had a brain blast and I prayed for it and it came, I'm not going to be like, and then Jesus came to me and said, the plants will grow, if you use like a Southern Baptist preacher. Okay. I won't go that way. In the same way that when I am in a religious situation, unless provoked, because in my church, they know I'm a scientist, but unless provoked, I'm not necessarily talking science when I'm experiencing my own connection with my Savior. And I think I feel the way I do because of my religiosity, where I can't shake either. You know what I mean? Like I can't, even when I am being a scientist, I can't necessarily put down my faith. And when I am in a faith situation, I can't necessarily put down the science. So there's times where I have to blend both. I think that the world would be a better place if we could respect people's views regardless, whether you have the same beliefs as me or different in religiosity, or whether you understand this science or not. I think that science and faith both have a place in the world, and both in their own beautiful ways. And I feel like faith is sometimes a cheat sheet of science. The main thing is whatever they're trying to teach you, whether it's in some moral of how to exist in the world, versus science, which is an understanding of the world, not necessarily how to exist in it, outside of, again, the social sciences, but how to understand the world. And I think if we took the concepts of both of them and didn't oppose them as villains, but made them like fraternal siblings, then we could go further. I hope that makes sense.
I love the imagery of the three boats. Mm-hmm. And I love that idea of siblings too. I think that's a great way of thinking it too. It reminds me of the saying that, when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And I think, it is easy to treat science that way, or it is easy to treat religion that way. But if there's a disease occurring and you want to cure that disease, we need a vaccine, and we need the processes of science to develop that vaccine. When you want to find a direction in your life, a purpose for your life, when you're experiencing a terrible, terrible crisis in your life, and you need something to hold on to help you get through that crisis, for a lot of people, maybe not everybody, but for a lot of people, religion is going to serve that purpose. So it comes down to, what's the best tool for the job, and it may not be a hammer for every job.
It may not be.
I'm going to ask you that same question I asked you last time that I ask at every one of my episodes. And if your answer is the same, that's great. And if it's different, that's great too. But what is your dream right now?
My dream right now is to be in a situation or a place, a season, an era, a time, whatever you want to call it, whereas I am able to be sustained by my platform as a chocolate botanist, whether it is speaking or brand deals or whatever it is, to be able to do this that I love, being able to converse with all of you, to talk science, to laugh and joke and touch plants, and know that I can do that without having to do the busy work that a lot of us do to survive. In addition to being able to positively impact other people, to show them the truth and the awesomeness of science and what it means to be a Black scientist in these streets. I have ran into, being a Black person in often white spaces, I have ran into my share of uncomfortable situations. I've ran into my share of racist situations, and I've ran into my share of great wins and excellence. But that journey with, all the potholes and the nails in the street and broken glass and the people who strip your tires when you're not looking has also been filled with times where I'm like, oh, okay, I'm pleasantly surprised. My car is still here. Like, things have worked. To use a car as an example of the journey. My car is still here. It's now got more gas than it did before. Like, somebody's really, paying attention and keeping out for me. So that is where I think my dream would be, to be in a place where I can provide for me and my family off of what I do, in addition to being able to be more prevalent for the Black and brown youth of the future who want to be scientists.
That is wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. And as somebody who has listened to some of your lectures and heard you teach, it would be wonderful to see that dream come true, because you're really good at what you do.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Derek's website is thechocolatebotanist.com. You can find him on Instagram as The Chocolate Botanist. He's on LinkedIn, and his email is derek@thechocolatebotanist.com. We'll include all of those links in the show notes, and you'll also find links there to the articles about Henrietta Lacks that we promised to share. Today's episode is sponsored by Native Plants. That's not a company. I'm talking about the plants that you see outside. To tell us more about native plants, here's my wife, Lauren Green, who is the Youth Environmental Education Specialist at the North Carolina Botanical Garden.
Native plants are plants that have grown somewhere naturally for a long, long, long time and have evolved in a particular habitat along with the animals that live there. Growing native plants in your own yard has many advantages. One advantage to growing native plants is that they create habitat, which is food, shelter, water, and space, for many native animals, including pollinators. Native plants are also easier to grow and maintain in their native habitat as they have evolved in that space.
You can learn more about native plants and our other sponsors on our podcast website, creatingacoolerworld.com.
All right. We did it. The dogs finally quieted down. And if you're wondering what the dogs are doing, they finally fell asleep.